The first thing she did was stand on her toes to reach the counter lip. She was that small. Her fingers came over the edge and she pulled herself up slightly, the way a child does when they need to be taken seriously, and she looked at me with mint green eyes that were too steady for someone her age, and she said the thing that I have been turning over in my mind for the 3 months since it happened, and have never once stopped thinking about. She said, "Give me to a human, please. My sister has done awful things to me." I want to be precise about what I heard. Not the words exactly, I heard those clearly. Her compact standard was accented but clean, the grammar careful in the way that people use when they have practiced a sentence many times before saying it. What I mean is that I want to be precise about the weight of it, because in 12 years on the intake counter at Kethasa Waystation, I have heard a great many things. I have heard Velasar merchants dispute transit classifications for 4 hours without pausing for breath. I have heard compact inquiry officers deliver findings with the affect of a man reading weather reports. I have heard children cry, adults threaten, enforcement units recite legal authority in the flat cadence of people who know the words and nothing else. I have heard once a man die quietly on the floor of the intake hall while his paperwork was still being processed, and I had to note the time and continue because the queue behind him was 11 people long and the way station does not stop for paperwork, not even that paperwork. What I had not heard in 12 years was a small alien child pull herself up to my counter and ask to be placed with a human because her sister had done awful things to her. I set my pen down. I folded my hands on the counter's surface. I looked at her. Kethasa Waystation is not a large facility. It handles cargo transit and a modest passenger volume, mostly Velasar commercial traffic and Federation contractors moving between the inner corridor stations and the outer plateau settlements. The intake hall is long and low, bright from the strip windows that run the full length of the east wall. We get good morning light, which is the one architectural decision about this building that I unreservedly approve of. The counter runs across the north end, 4 stations, though usually only 2 or 3 are staffed. Mine is the second from the left. I have worked it for so long that the surface in front of my chair is worn slightly smoother than the rest, and the right-hand drawer sticks a little on humid mornings. I know every sound the hall makes. I know the particular echo of freight cart wheels on the stone floor, and the way the ventilation shifts when the outer cargo doors open, and the specific quality of quiet that means the hall is empty versus the quality of quiet that means someone is waiting and trying not to be noticed. She had not been trying not to be noticed. She had walked in through the public entrance at 8:42 on a clear 4th-month morning, crossed the hall without hesitating and come directly to my counter. Purposeful, like she had a destination and had known it before she arrived. She was Velasar, I thought at first, the ash-gray skin, the pointed ears, the oversized eyes that catch light in a way that makes you feel they are recording you more thoroughly than you would like. But her coloring was off for standard Velasar registration. Too pale, even for the Ashtone subclade. Her hair was white-silver, fine and somewhat matted on the right side, as though she had slept on it for a long time without being permitted to attend to it. She wore a gray-green tunic that was too large for her, belted with a piece of braided cord, and her feet were in plain, flat transit shoes that were also too large and had been stuffed at the toe with what looked like folded cloth. She was clean. I noted that specifically because it told me something. She had not been living rough. Whoever's house she had come from had kept her fed, clothed, and clean. What they had not done, and I was not yet drawing conclusions, I was simply noting, was provide her with clothing or footwear that fitted, and she had arrived at my counter alone, without a guardian notation on her form, and she had asked to be placed with a human before I had even opened an intake file. She had known to ask that. That was the thing I kept returning to, even then, before I understood the full shape of it. She had known exactly where to go and exactly what to say when she got there. I pulled a blank intake form from the tray, Standard procedure. When a minor presents at a Federation transit counter without a guardian notation, you open an intake file before you do anything else. You do not ask why they are alone. You do not ask where they came from. You open the file, you begin the record, and you let them talk in their own order. That is the training, and the training is correct, because what you are building in those first minutes is a document that may later be the most important thing standing between this person and whatever they came here to get away from. Name, I said. Sova Elm. She spelled it for me without being asked, slowly watching my pen. Velasar subclade Kethosaveran, secondary designation. She paused. Not primary, secondary. That last line was careful and deliberate. She was telling me something about her legal status, and she was making sure I wrote it down correctly. In Velasar household law, a secondary designation means a household dependent registered to a primary line member, not a free individual, not a ward in the Federation sense, but a bound subordinate. It is a classification that compact law views with extreme discomfort, and has been trying to phase out through a series of increasingly pointed bilateral accords for the past 40 years, with limited success, because Velasar household law has been in continuous operation since before the compact was formed, and its practitioners are very good at filing around compact objections. Secondary designation. She had walked into a Federation transit point and led with her legal category. She was not a child who had wandered in after getting separated from her people. She was a child who had come here knowing exactly what she was and exactly what she needed to say, and who was making certain that the person behind the counter had the information they needed to help her. I wrote it down, all of it. I wrote it exactly as she said it without interpretation, because the intake record is a record, not a summary. Age, I said. I do not know my exact age. She said this with no apology and no distress. My sister removed my household documentation when she registered me as secondary. I was told I was young enough that it did not matter. I looked at her for a moment. I kept my face as I always keep it on the counter, neutral, attentive, giving nothing away. 12 years of intake work teaches you to receive information without reacting to it, because the moment you visibly react, you have entered into the situation, and until the file is open and the record is established, your job is to receive and document, not to respond. The reacting comes later. The filing comes first. I wrote, age unknown. Documentation reportedly removed by registering party at time of secondary designation. Then, below that, on the physical observation line, minor appears to be approximately 7 to 10 years of age by physical development markers. Clothing and footwear do not fit subject and appear sized for a significantly larger individual. Who is your registering party? I said. Veth Kale Set. She said the name the way you say a thing that has weight, not with drama, but with the specific deliberateness of someone who has thought carefully about saying it out loud in an official setting. Velasar primary line, Kethosaveran household. She is my elder sister. I wrote the name. I also wrote below it, registering party is biological relative of the dependent, sibling relationship. How did you come to this waystation? I said. I walked most of the morning from the household compound, and then I used the cargo transit for the last section. She glanced briefly at the hall behind her, then back at me. Kethosa Cargo Transit does not cross-check secondary dependent registrations. The code lists secondary dependents under non-sapient freight classification for transit tracking purposes. I read the transit schedule while doing the household correspondence filing. Veth Kaleset did not know I had read it. There was no pride in the way she said it and no bravado. It was simply information. She had done what she had done, and now she was here, and she was telling me how because I had asked. She had identified a gap in the tracking system and used it, the way a practical person uses whatever is available to them, and she had done it without making it into a story about herself. I noted the transit method. "Why did you ask for a human specifically?" I said. This was not a field on the standard form. I asked it anyway, because it was the question that had been sitting at the edge of my mind since she said the words, and because the answer was going to shape how I filed the next 30 minutes of paperwork. She considered for a moment. Her feet, in their too large shoes, shifted slightly on the floor below the counter where I couldn't see them, but I could hear the slight movement. "There was a Velasar woman at the secondary household compound," she said. "She came to do maintenance work on the water filtration unit. She was assigned from a compact registered contractor, which meant Veth Kaleset could not refuse the visit without triggering a contract violation notice. She was there for 4 days. A pause. We spoke during the work periods. Veth Kaleset monitored the household areas, but the filtration unit access shaft is outside the household monitoring radius. She had known that too. She had cataloged every gap in her situation with the patient thoroughness of someone who has had nothing but time and the need to pay attention. She told me, Sovelm continued, that if a Velasar secondary ever needed to be safe, they should go to a Federation intake counter and ask for a human officer. She said humans honor the ask. She held my gaze steadily. She said they always have. I did not say anything for a moment. I looked at the form in front of me. I looked at the spaces I had filled in, the careful record building itself line by line, her name spelled for me, her legal category given without prompting, her registering party's name offered with that specific deliberate weight, her method of arrival explained practically and without complaint. And now this. A maintenance worker who had spoken to her through 4 days of work in an access shaft, who had told her what to do, who had given her the one sentence she had carried here and said out loud at my counter. I reached into the right-hand drawer and took out the stamp. It is a Federation-issue intake notation stamp, the standard kind used at every compact registered transit point. Rubber face, wooden handle, the text reading Protected Party, Compact Article 14 hold in a clean block font. The rubber face has a hairline crack across the top arc of the P from where I dropped it 3 years ago on the stone floor during a particularly difficult shift. I have requested a replacement twice. The replacement requests are presumably still making their way through the procurement queue somewhere. The stamp has never misprinted despite the crack, which I take as confirmation that the crack is cosmetic. I inked it on the pad. I pressed it to the intake form, hard and even, directly below Sovelm's name and above the secondary designation notation. I held it down for the full count of 3 that the training recommends for a clean impression. I lifted it. The stamp mark came up sharp and dark, the cracked P printed as cleanly as all the rest. She watched me do it. She had not moved since I reached for the drawer. She watched the whole thing with those steady mint-green eyes, tracking the motion of the stamp from ink pad to form with the focused attention of someone who understands that what is happening in front of them matters. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means your intake file has a compact Article 14 hold flag to it," I said. Article 14 governs welfare holds for sapient minors presenting at Federation transit points without guardian notation. The hold means that, for the next 72 hours, no third party can remove you from this waystation, pending a compact welfare inquiry. It means you are here, and you are staying here, and no one can take you anywhere until the inquiry is complete. I set the stamp down on the counter surface and met her eyes. "I'm filing the welfare inquiry now." She looked at the stamp impression on the form. She looked at it for a long time, reading the words, and I watched her read them, and I watched the quality of stillness in her change. Not dramatically, not with any visible sign that someone else would have noticed. But I have been watching people receive information across a counter for 12 years, and I know the difference between stillness that is waiting and stillness that has arrived. "Will my sister come?" she said. Probably, I said. The household tracking system will have been notified when your transit chip was read at the cargo terminal. She'll know you're in this district. She'll figure out the waystation. Will you still be here? I work a 12-hour shift, I said. I'll be here for another 9 of them. After that, my colleague Dava will be on the counter. The hold is attached to the file, not to me specifically. It doesn't move when I do. She nodded slowly, filing this information the way she filed everything. Carefully, completely, placing it in the correct location in whatever internal catalog she was building. Can I sit somewhere? She said. I came out from behind the counter. The intake officer does not usually do that. We are counter staff, not escort staff. And the secure intake room is 15 steps from the counter and perfectly findable without assistance. But she was small, and the hall was not empty at this hour. A cargo crew loading at the far end and 2 transit passengers on the bench by the east window, and she had been walking since early morning, and the 2 large shoes were making her gait deliberate and careful in a way that had nothing to do with uncertainty. I walked her to the room myself. At the door she stopped. She turned and looked up at me. "Thank you," she said. It was the first sentence she had said that contained nothing except what it was. "The hold is standard procedure," I said. She looked at me for a moment with the particular look of a child who has spent time learning to read adults, who has learned to track the space between what is said and what is meant, because the space was sometimes the most important part. Then she went inside and I heard the lock click from the inside, and I went back to the counter. I filed the inquiry at 9:17. That is fast by compact inquiry standards. The standard processing window for a minor welfare flag is 2 hours. I have filed enough of these over 12 years that I know every field, every required annotation, and every cross-reference the system will reject if it is absent or imprecise. I filed it in 40 minutes because I wanted it timestamped and active before the sister's household had time to be notified through official channels that a secondary dependent had accessed a cargo transit vehicle. Household notification of secondary departure is automatic under Velasar registration code. The moment Sova Elm's transit chip was read at the cargo terminal, a departure alert would have been sent to the household registry. I did not know how far away the household compound was. I did not know how fast the sister would move. What I knew was that an inquiry timestamp before a recovery writ changes the procedural order, and procedural order determines which party is arguing against which. A recovery writ filed against an active compact inquiry hold has to argue against the hold. A hold filed against an active recovery writ has to argue against the writ. The distinction seems minor until you are standing on one side or the other of it. Then it is everything. The inquiry was timestamped at 9:17. At 11:04, the recovery officer arrived. He was Velasar professional, wearing a house-registered compliance uniform with the Kethosaveran household designation on the left breast, a dark crest stitched in thread that had cost money. He was carrying a sealed transit case, and he walked directly to my counter without looking at any of the other stations, which told me the household had already identified which officer had opened the intake file. He set the transit case on the counter. He produced the household bond writ, a thick document, stamped and sealed, the Kethosaveran household designation impressed in dark blue wax at the lower right margin. He stated his name and his appointment authority clearly and without excess. He told me he was there to recover a secondary dependent registered to the Velasar primary line of Veth Kailset, designation Sova Elm, who had departed the household compound without authorization that morning and had been tracked to this transit point by registration chip reading. He presented the bilateral protocol form, the document that invokes the Federation Velasar bilateral agreement governing secondary dependent recovery from Federation transit points. He was calm. He had done this before, I could tell. He had a way of presenting documents that was neither aggressive nor apologetic, just precise, the manner of a professional who has learned to let the paperwork carry the weight. I let him finish. I did not interrupt. I listened to everything he said and I looked at everything he presented, and when he was done I said, "I'm aware of the individual. She presented at this counter at 8:42 this morning. Her intake file is currently under a compact Article 14 hold, timestamped 9/17. The hold is active." He had encountered Article 14 holds before. He was already opening the transit case for the bilateral protocol form before I finished the sentence. He told me that the bilateral protocol between the Federation Compact and the Velasar Household Authority Registration Bureau provided for recovery of secondary dependents from Federation transit points subject to a 24-hour notification window, and that he was serving the notification now, and that the 24-hour recovery window superseded a standard Article 14 hold under the bilateral agreement. He was correct. That provision exists, and he had read it accurately. The bilateral protocol's 24-hour recovery provision applies to standard Article 14 holds, I said. The hold on this file is not a standard Article 14 hold. It is an Article 14 hold flagged to an active compact minor welfare inquiry, filed at 9:17 this morning, reference number Kethasa 0917 MWI 441. I produced the inquiry confirmation from the file tray under the counter. A hold flagged to an active welfare inquiry is governed by Article 14, Subclause 9. Subclause 9 welfare inquiry holds are not subject to bilateral recovery protocol override during the inquiry window. They run for 72 hours from timestamp, and they require a compact regional welfare officer's written clearance to lift, which cannot be issued until the inquiry is reviewed. I set the confirmation on the counter so he could see the timestamp. The inquiry has a minimum review window of 48 hours from submission. He was quiet. He looked at the confirmation. He looked at the stamp impression on Sova Elm's intake form, which I had placed beside the confirmation for his inspection. He looked at the timestamp. He did the arithmetic. The inquiry was filed before the recovery writ, he said. By 1 hour and 47 minutes, I said. He was a professional. He understood what that meant in terms of what he could and could not do from this point. He looked at the bilateral protocol form in his hand for a moment, then put it back in the transit case. "My client will contest the inquiry," he said. "She's entitled to," I said. "The Regional Welfare Office contact details are at the bottom of the inquiry confirmation. The contest window is 48 hours from inquiry submission. If a contest is filed, it will be reviewed alongside the inquiry. In the interim, the hold remains active." He picked up the inquiry confirmation. He studied it, all of it, not just the timestamp, but the reference fields and the supporting observations I had included. I saw his eyes stop on the section about the clothing and footwear. I saw them stop again on the line about documentation removal. He put the confirmation in the transit case. He closed the case. He thanked me formally, which I noted because it is what a professional does when they have lost a procedural exchange and want to preserve the working relationship for subsequent steps. He was still calm, but there was a weight in how he moved now that had not been there when he arrived. He left. I noted his visit in the file. I noted the bilateral protocol claim, the documents presented, the provisions cited, and the outcome. I noted the exact time he arrived and the exact time he left. I wrote it all in the flat neutral language that a file requires, without interpretation, because an intake record is not a story about what happened. It is a record of what happened, and the difference matters when someone reads it later looking for grounds to challenge. Then I went to the secure intake room and knocked twice and gave my name. There was a pause. Then the lock clicked open from the inside. She was sitting in one of the chairs with her knees drawn up, her arms around them. The room was quiet and the window was showing the loading yard, midday light coming in at a clean angle across the table. She had been listening to the voices from the hall. I could tell not the words, because the shared wall is too thick for words to travel, but the fact of voices and the duration and the tone. "He came," she said. "Yes. He left." "For now," I said. "He'll file a contest or come back with an amended approach, but not in the next 72 hours and not without going through the welfare inquiry review first." I sat down in the chair across from her. "I've filed the inquiry. It will take at least 48 hours to be reviewed. The recovery hold runs through that window." She looked at the table for a moment. "What happens after the inquiry?" "That depends on what the inquiry finds," I said. I chose the next words with care, the way you always should when you are speaking to someone who is weighing every one of them. "If the inquiry finds evidence of mistreatment of a secondary dependent, the household bond writ becomes subject to a welfare review. A welfare review can result in the writ being suspended, amended, or dissolved." "Can it find that," she said, "without the documentation she removed?" "It can document the physical presentation of the dependent," I said. "It can document the stated removal of records by the registering party at time of registration, which is itself a notable circumstance. It can document the age classification discrepancy. It can document the fact that the dependent's clothing and footwear were not fitted to her. It can document voluntary statements." I paused. "An intake officer can submit physical observations as part of an inquiry filing. I included mine." She looked at me for a long time. Something in her face was still and also not still, the particular expression of a person who has been waiting for a specific thing and has just been told it might actually be there. "Are you going to ask me what she did?" she said. Her voice was level. She was not asking me not to. She was asking whether I was going to. "Not today," I said. "The inquiry will have a welfare officer assigned. That conversation will happen in the right setting, with the right kind of time and the right person conducting it. What I needed to do this morning was make sure you were here when it could happen." "That's done." She nodded, a small, slow nod that was also somehow a form of settling, something putting itself down after being held for a long time. "She used to say I was registered property," she said, not as the beginning of a longer account, just as a fact she had decided to put in the room. "She used to say the documentation proved it and the compact couldn't override it. She used to say there was no point going anywhere because the system would return me." She paused. I thought, if I could find the right counter, the documentation would stop meaning what she said it meant. "Correct," I said. She looked at the window. The loading yard was in full midday sun, a cargo vehicle moving slowly along the far perimeter, dust rising in the light. "Are you hungry?" I said. She blinked. It was the first moment in our entire conversation that she looked genuinely surprised, as though the question had arrived from a direction she had not been watching. "Yes," she said after a brief pause. "I have been walking since before morning." I went to the waystation commissary and brought back a standard transit meal, the pressed grain block with the packet of dried fruit, which is what the waystation stocks for passengers in hold status. It is not a meal anyone would request if they had options. It is food, and it is here, and at this particular moment that is the relevant fact. I also brought the grain tea from the commissary dispenser, which is genuinely good, a point in this waystation's favor that I acknowledge freely. I set them on the table. She looked at them, then at me. "Thank you," she said. "Intake procedure for minors in hold status includes provision of nutrition," I said. She gave me the look, the specific look she had given me twice already, the one that said, "I understand what you are saying, and I also understand the shape of the space between what you are saying and what you mean, and I am choosing not to make it difficult for you." She ate the pressed grain block with a focused steadiness that told me she had learned to treat food as a thing to be attended to and not wasted. She drank the tea carefully, warming her hands on the cup. I stayed in the chair across from her because leaving a child alone in a room with a lock while they eat their first food of the day seemed like the wrong thing to do. And because, after 12 years on the counter, I have developed some tolerance for making decisions that are not in any protocol document. We did not talk much. After a while she asked how long I had worked the counter. I told her 12 years. She asked if I had always been at Kethasa. I told her I had transferred from Velmarin waystation 9 years ago. She asked why. I told her the grain tea at Velmarin was unreliable, that the commissary sourced it from a regional supplier with inconsistent quality, and it came out flat more often than not, whereas Kethasa sources directly from the Velketh Plateau growers and has never once disappointed me. She was quiet for a moment. Then something near a smile moved through her expression, not a full one, but the shape of one, like light passing briefly through cloud cover. "That is a very specific reason to change postings," she said. "I had others," I said, "but that was sufficient." She drank the rest of the tea. She slept that night in the secure intake room. I requisitioned a transit cot from the waystation stores before my shift ended, which is not strictly within my counter role but which the store's operator, a Kethasavar man named Delt who has been here since before my time, produced without commentary when I explained the situation. He sent a blanket along as well, which I had not requested. Delt has his own sense of what a situation requires. My shift ended at 2000. Before I left, I briefed my colleague Dava on the full file, the hold and its subclause classification, the inquiry reference number, the recovery officer's visit and its outcome, the bilateral protocol claim, and the provisions that made it inapplicable. Dava has been on the counter for 8 years, and she does not need information explained to her twice. I had no concerns about leaving the file in her hands. I went to my quarters in the residential block. I ate. I read, which is what I do most evenings. I did not sleep especially well, which is unusual. I am not given to lying awake over the day's files. In 12 years I have learned that an accurate record and a correctly time-stamped hold are better defenses for the people in your files than any amount of anxious review, and that sleeping keeps your mind sharp enough to maintain both. But I lay awake longer than usual, thinking about a small person in 2 large shoes who had memorized a sentence and walked most of the morning to say it out loud to a stranger. The welfare officer assigned to the inquiry was a regional officer named Corin, a woman I had filed with on 2 prior cases over the last 4 years, both clean, both concluded with the outcomes the evidence warranted. She arrived at the waystation at 10:30 the following morning, reviewed the file with me for 20 minutes, and then went into the secure intake room alone. I do not know the content of what Sovailm told her. That is not my information to hold. I processed 16 other intake forms during the 2 hours Corin spent in the room, and I kept my attention on the counter and my work. When Corin came out, she crossed the hall to my station and stood at the counter for a moment before she said anything. She had the look of someone arranging a large amount of information into the correct order, not troubled exactly, but occupied in a way that went past professional routine. She said she was extending the inquiry to the full welfare investigation protocol. She said she was issuing a secondary hold notice to the Velasar Household Authority Registration Bureau, suspending the household bond writ pending investigation outcome. She said she was recommending immediate interim protective status under Compact Article 9, Subclause 12, which covers sapient minors who have made a voluntary placement request at a Federation transit point. Article 9, Subclause 12. I knew that provision. I had read it 14 months ago during my second full end-to-end review of the intake code. I read the full code every few years because it is amended regularly, and I prefer to know exactly what is in it, rather than relying on memory of a version that may have changed. Article 9, Subclause 12 says that a voluntary placement request made by a sapient minor at a Federation transit point cannot be overridden by a third-party household instrument during an active welfare investigation. It says the minor's expressed preference as to the identity or type of placement guardian shall be given weight in the inquiry's recommendations. And it says, this is the line I had noted when I read it, the kind of line that tends to matter in specific circumstances. It says the minor's preference shall be honored where no compelling safety or welfare reason exists to do otherwise. She had asked for a human. She had known to ask for a human, and the code said her preference would be honored where no reason existed to do otherwise. There was no reason to do otherwise. Corin said, I'll need the Article 9 paperwork processed by end of day. She paused. Then she said, she told me about the documentation removal, the age classification. She said she's been in that household since their parents died, which she estimates at approximately 3 years ago based on seasonal cycles. She said, Corin stopped. She looked at the counter surface briefly. She said, it was a thorough conversation, and she left to make her calls. I processed the Article 9 paperwork. It took 20 minutes. I attached the relevant subclause text from the physical code reference binder as supporting material, which is not required, but reduces the surface area for a procedural challenge. Then I inked the stamp and pressed it to the new form, even and firm, the full count of 3. Clean impression, cracked P, clean print. I brought the paperwork to the secure intake room. Sova Elm was in the same chair, but differently, less carefully contained, the particular compression of someone maintaining themselves loosened slightly. The 2 large shoes were off and placed neatly under the chair. She had worked at the matted section of her hair while Corin was there, not fully but enough that it was holding. I sat down and explained what the paperwork meant, the interim protective status, the investigation window, Article 9, Subclause 12, and what her expressed preference meant under it. She listened to all of it, and when I finished, she asked one question. How long would the investigation take? I told her the standard window was 60 to 90 days. She nodded, setting the number in its place. Is there somewhere I can stay during that time? She said. I told her about the interim placement accommodation, the proper quarters room in the residential block that the waystation maintains for welfare holds of extended duration. I told her she could access the common areas during the day. I told her the secure intake room had the inside lock and that she could use it any time she wanted a space that was unambiguously hers. She looked at me. You mean if I am frightened? I mean if you want it, I said. She was quiet for a moment. She used to lock rooms from the outside, she said. It was said flatly, without performance. A fact placed in the record. I know the difference between those two things, I said. She looked at me for a moment longer, then she nodded. Over the weeks that followed, I saw her in the waystation common areas during the day, the commissary, the open space beside the loading yard window. She had been given clothing from the welfare allocation, things that fitted, shoes that fitted. She looked different in them. Not taller, not older, but more solid, more fully present, as though clothing that acknowledged her actual dimensions had returned something to her that the ill-fitting gray-green tunic had been quietly taking away. She read. The waystation has a small library, physical books in a rack, the kind that transit passengers leave behind and others pick up. She went through it systematically, starting from the left and working her way along. She read everything, including the technical manual on cargo transit vehicle maintenance procedures that has been in the rack since before my time, and that I had always assumed was there as a deterrent. Once, at the end of a shift, I found her at a commissary table with the compact citizen information sheet from the waystation rack, the one about intake procedures and welfare rights. It is a 3-page document with small print that I had never seen a transit passenger read with any particular attention. She looked up when I came in. This is the provision you used, she said, pointing. Article 14, Subclause 9. Yes, I said. And this one, Article 9, Subclause 12. This is the one that means they have to honor what I asked for. If the investigation recommends it, I said, yes. She looked at the form for a while, then she looked at me. She said humans honor the ask, she said. The maintenance woman, a pause. I think she meant something specific by that. Not just that humans would help, that the system, the Federation intake system, was made by people who thought a request like mine was worth writing a provision for, that someone sat down and decided it should be in the code. She looked at the information sheet. Someone thought to put it there. I had not considered it in quite those terms before, but she was not wrong. Probably, I said. She nodded, confirming something she had already mostly concluded on her own. I want to learn all of it, she said. She held up the information sheet. The intake code, the welfare provisions, the bilateral protocols. I want to understand what is in them, and why it is in them, and what it means in practice. I looked at her across the commissary table, in the late afternoon light coming through the west window, in the shoes that fitted. The intake code reference binder is behind the counter, I said. I'll leave a copy in the welfare room for you in the morning. She held my gaze. Thank you, she said. I just nodded, and I went home and I slept well. The investigation concluded at 63 days. I counted them because 63 days is useful data about how the compact timeline actually operates in practice, and because accurate data is worth keeping. The recovery officer filed his contest at the 46-hour mark, 2 hours before the window closed. Corin's office received it, reviewed it, and dismissed it in 11 days on the grounds that the bilateral protocol provision cited did not apply to a welfare inquiry hold of the relevant subclause classification, which was exactly the argument I had made to him at the counter, now in formal documentation from a regional welfare office rather than from an intake officer. The dismissal letter was thorough. I read it when Corin forwarded a copy to the file. The sister filed a second contest through a different procedural channel, this one arguing that the voluntary placement request was not valid because a secondary dependent lacked the legal standing to make a placement preference at a Federation transit point. Corin's office addressed this in the investigation proper. Article 9, Subclause 12 does not predicate the validity of a placement request on the requesting party's household classification. It predicates it on sapience and voluntary presentation at a Federation transit point. Sova met both criteria. The challenge was dismissed. I noted the dismissal in the file with the same flat neutral language I note everything, because a file is not a tally of victories, it is a record of events, and each event belongs there in plain language regardless of its direction. What happened during the middle weeks of the investigation was quieter than the procedural exchanges. Corin made 3 visits to the waystation during the 63 days, each one involving a session with Sova in the secure intake room that I was not present for, and each one involving a brief debrief with me afterward. The debriefs were short. Corin would give me the procedural update, which challenges had been filed, which had been dismissed, where the investigation stood, and occasionally she would say something that was not strictly procedural. Once she said, she has a very good memory. Once she said, I want you to know the inquiry scope has been expanded. I want you to know it is not a minor matter. I told her I had not assumed it was. She nodded and she left, and I went back to the counter. The household bond writ was dissolved on grounds of sustained welfare violation. The Velasar Household Authority Registration Bureau was notified. The dissolution carried an ancillary investigation referral requiring the Bureau to review its registration practices for secondary dependents in the Kethasaveran district. A referral that sits in a queue somewhere and will take time to complete, but that is in the record and cannot be unfiled. The household of Veth Kaleset lost its compact bilateral registration status. It is an administrative outcome rather than a criminal one. It means the household can no longer invoke the bilateral protocol to make recovery claims at Federation transit points. It means their operational capacity in Federation-adjacent space is substantially curtailed. It means the reach is shorter. What the ancillary referral and the expanded inquiry scope may produce beyond that I do not yet know, because those processes are not my file and I have not been briefed on their progress. What I know is that SOVA-ILN is here and the writ is dissolved, and the household cannot reach this waystation through the protocol they relied on. Some endings are not dramatic. Some endings are a database entry and a changed registration status and a household that can no longer use the tool it used. They are the correct shape of ending regardless. The placement recommendation came back consistent with the expressed preference, a human guardian. The inquiry found no welfare or safety reason to recommend otherwise. I was asked, as the intake officer of record, whether I was willing to serve as interim placement guardian pending long-term placement identification. Interim placement at a transit waystation is unusual. It requires a welfare log submitted monthly. It is additional paperwork, and I do not object to paperwork. I said yes. I said yes without a great deal of deliberation, which perhaps requires some explanation, because I am not a person who is commonly described as warm or given to gestures. 12 years on the intake counter at a mid-volume cargo waystation is not a role that selects for sentimentality. The counter selects for accuracy and patience and a thorough knowledge of the relevant code. I have those things. I am also 51 years old and I live in the waystation residential block, and I eat commissary meals and I read in the evenings. And there is not a great deal in my daily life that requires me to be anything other than accurate and patient. What I mean is that saying yes was not a sacrifice. It was the next thing the situation required. I have learned in 12 years to recognize when a situation requires something specific of the person on the counter, and to do that thing, and not to make it more complicated than that. She moved from the secure intake room into a proper quarters room in the residential block, 2 doors down from mine, with a window that faces east. She told me she preferred east-facing windows because you can see the weather coming in from the peaks before it arrives. She said she had grown up in a compound with no east-facing windows and had learned to read weather from sounds and pressure changes instead, and that she preferred to see it directly. She continued working through the physical library and through the intake code reference binder I had left for her. She finished the binder in 11 days and came to the counter with 7 questions, all of them good questions about provisions where the written language is less precise than the practice it governs. I answered each one as accurately as I could, noting where my case knowledge was limited. She asked me once more about the maintenance worker, whether I thought the woman had been helped by the same provisions herself, once. I told her I didn't know. I told her it was possible. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to find out someday, not for any particular reason, just so the record is complete. I understand that. There are things you want to know not because the knowing changes what has already happened, but because it belongs in the account. Because the people who did the thing and the people who asked and the people who answered are all part of the same sequence, and a sequence is better known completely than partially. I keep my files carefully. I have done so for 12 years. 17 intake forms on the morning she arrived, a stamp with a cracked P in the right-hand drawer. On the morning after the investigation closed, I pulled the stamp out and inked it once on a spare form, just to confirm the impression. The cracked P printed clean. It always does. I put it back in the drawer. The replacement request is still in the queue somewhere. I am no longer interested in the replacement arriving.